The divorce papers shook in Margaret's wrinkled hands as she sat in her lawyer's office on that cold Tuesday morning in January. At 69 years old, after 50 years of marriage, she was about to do something that everyone said was crazy. Her own children had begged her not to. Her sister called her foolish. The neighbors whispered behind her back, but Margaret didn't care anymore. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Mrs. Thompson?" her young lawyer asked, looking concerned. "After 5 decades together, this is a big step." Margaret looked up from the papers, her gray eyes fierce and determined. "I've never been more sure of anything in my entire life," she said, her voice steady despite the tears rolling down her cheeks. "I'm not just getting divorced. I'm saving my soul." She picked up the black pen with trembling fingers and signed, her name on the line that would end her marriage to Robert Thompson forever. As the ink dried on the paper, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. But what had brought her to this moment? What could make a woman throw away 50 years of marriage when most people her age were celebrating their golden anniversaries? The answer lay in 5 decades of silent suffering that nobody knew about. It all started on a warm spring day in 1974. Margaret was just 19 years old, working at the local diner in her small town of Millbrook, Ohio. She had long brown hair that she wore in a ponytail, bright green eyes, and dreams bigger than her tiny hometown. She wanted to go to college, maybe become a teacher, and see the world beyond the cornfields that surrounded her neighborhood. That's when Robert walked into her life. He was 23, tall and handsome with dark hair and a smile that made her heart skip. He wore nice clothes and drove a shiny red car that made all the other girls in town jealous. Robert worked at his father's successful car dealership and had money in his pocket. More importantly, he seemed to really like Margaret. "You're the prettiest girl in this whole town," he told her on their first date as they sat by the lake eating ice cream. "I think I'm falling in love with you already." Margaret blushed and felt butterflies in her stomach. No boy had ever talked to her like that before. At 19, she thought love was supposed to feel like fireworks and racing hearts. Robert made her feel special, chosen, important. He brought her flowers every week. He took her to nice restaurants in the next town over. He told her she was beautiful every single day. When he proposed after just 6 months of dating, Margaret said yes without thinking twice. "We don't need to wait," Robert said as he slipped the small diamond ring on her finger. "When you know, you know. Let's get married next month." Margaret's mother thought they were rushing things. "You're so young, honey," she said, worry lines creasing her forehead. "Maybe you should wait a year or two. Get to know each other better." But Margaret was head over heels in love. She thought her mother was just being old-fashioned. "Mom, when it's true love, you don't need to wait," she said confidently. "Robert and I are perfect for each other." Looking back now, Margaret realized she had been so naive. She had confused attention with love and possessiveness with caring. The wedding was small but beautiful. Margaret wore her grandmother's white dress, and Robert looked handsome in his black suit. All their friends and family came to celebrate. Everyone said they made a perfect couple. On their honeymoon, Margaret got her first real glimpse of the man she had married. They had gone to a small cabin by a lake about 2 hours from home. It was supposed to be romantic and peaceful. On their second day there, Margaret wanted to take a walk by herself to pick wildflowers for their dinner table. "Where do you think you're going?" Robert asked, his voice sharp in a way she had never heard before. "Just for a little walk," Margaret said, confused by his tone. "I wanted to pick some flowers." Robert's face changed completely. The sweet, loving expression she was used to disappeared, replaced by something cold and angry. "You're not going anywhere without me," he said firmly. "We're on our honeymoon. You should want to spend every minute with your new husband." Margaret tried to laugh it off. "I'll just be gone for 20 minutes. You can see the path from the window." But Robert grabbed her arm tightly. Too tightly. It hurt. "I said no, Margaret. When I say no, I mean no. You need to learn that now." She stared at him in shock. The grip on her arm was starting to leave marks. This wasn't the gentle, loving man she had dated. "Robert, you're hurting me," she whispered. He let go immediately, and his face changed back to the sweet expression she knew. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I guess I'm just so in love with you that I can't stand the thought of you being away from me, even for a few minutes. Forgive me." Margaret was confused, But she was young and inexperienced. She thought maybe this was normal. Maybe all husbands felt this protective of their wives. Maybe it was even romantic that he wanted to be with her so much. "It's okay," she said, though something in her stomach felt wrong. "I understand." But it wasn't okay. It was just the beginning. Over their first year of marriage, Robert's controlling behavior got worse, but it happened so slowly that Margaret didn't really notice at first. He always had a reason that sounded reasonable. He didn't want her to work at the diner anymore, because married women should focus on their homes. He didn't want her to hang out with her single friends because they were a bad influence and might give her wrong ideas about marriage. He didn't want her to visit her family too often because we're building our own family now. One by one, Margaret lost all the things that had made her happy. Her job, her friends, her independence, even her weekly dinners with her parents became rare, but Robert was always sweet about it. He always had flowers, always had a good explanation, always made her feel like he was just looking out for her. Asterisk, "I love you so much that I want to take care of everything for you," he would say. "You don't need to worry about money or decisions or anything stressful. I'll handle it all." At first, Margaret thought this was wonderful. She felt taken care of, protected, loved. But slowly, she began to feel trapped. When she tried to talk to Robert about maybe getting a part-time job, he got that cold look in his eyes again. "Why would you want to work when I provide everything you need?" he asked. "Are you saying I'm not a good husband? Are you saying I can't take care of my wife?" "No, that's not what I meant," Margaret said quickly, scared of making him angry. "I just thought maybe I could help with the bills or save money for a house. I have everything under control," Robert said firmly. "Your job is to take care of our home. That's what wives do." By their second anniversary, Margaret felt like she was living in a beautiful prison. She had a nice house, pretty clothes, and a husband who everyone thought was wonderful. But she felt completely alone. The worst part was that Robert was charming to everyone else. Her family loved him. The neighbors thought he was the perfect husband. Even her old friends, when she occasionally saw them, would tell her how lucky she was to have found such a good man. "Robert is so thoughtful," her mother would say. "Look how he takes such good care of you. You don't have to worry about anything." Margaret began to doubt herself. Maybe she was being ungrateful. Maybe other wives felt this way too, but just didn't talk about it. Maybe this was just what marriage was like. But deep down, she knew something was very wrong. When Margaret was 21, she got pregnant with their first child. She was excited about becoming a mother, but she was also terrified of bringing a baby into a home where she felt so suffocated. "Now you'll really need to stay home," Robert said when she told him about the baby. "Children need their mothers to be completely devoted to them." Margaret nodded, but part of her felt like she was disappearing completely. During her pregnancy, Robert became even more controlling. He didn't want her to drive alone, didn't want her to go to doctor appointments by herself, didn't want her to make any decisions about the baby without asking him first. "I'm just being protective," he would say whenever Margaret complained. "You're carrying our child. I need to make sure you're both safe." But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like surveillance. Asterisk, when their daughter Sarah was born, Margaret felt a love stronger than anything she had ever experienced. Holding her tiny baby in her arms, she promised herself that she would be a good mother, no matter what. But Robert had opinions about that too. "Don't pick her up every time she cries," he told Margaret. "You'll spoil her. Don't let your mother come over so much. She'll interfere with how we raise our daughter. Don't read all those baby books. I'll tell you everything you need to know." Even motherhood, the one thing Margaret thought would truly be hers, became something Robert tried to control. Asterisk, as Sarah grew from a baby to a toddler, Margaret noticed that her daughter seemed scared of her father. When Robert came home from work, Sarah would run to Margaret and hide behind her legs. If Robert raised his voice, even just to call across the house, Sarah would start crying. Asterisk, "She's just going through a phase," Robert said dismissively. "All kids are scared of their fathers sometimes." But Margaret knew it was more than that. Children had good instincts. Sarah could sense the same tension that Margaret felt every day. When Sarah was 3 years old, something happened that Margaret would never forget. Asterisk. She was making dinner in the kitchen while Sarah played with her dolls in the living room. Margaret could hear her daughter talking to her toys, creating little stories and adventures. And then the princess ran away from the mean king, Sarah. was saying in her sweet little voice. She ran far, far away where he couldn't find her and hurt her anymore. Margaret stopped stirring the soup and listened more carefully. The princess was scared of the king because he was always angry, Sarah continued. So she took her baby and ran to the forest where she could be free. Margaret's heart broke. Even at 3 years old, her daughter understood that their home was not a happy place. Sarah was creating stories about escape because she could feel the tension and fear that filled their house every day. That night, after Sarah was asleep, Margaret tried to talk to Robert about their marriage. "I think we need to work on some things," she said carefully, sitting on the couch next to him while he watched TV. "I feel like we don't communicate very well sometimes." Robert didn't even look away from the television. "What's wrong with our communication? I tell you what needs to be done, and you do it. That's how marriage works." "But what about what I want?" Margaret asked quietly. "What about my feelings?" Now Robert did look at her, and his expression was ice cold. "Your feelings?" he said slowly. "What about my feelings? I work hard every day to provide for this family. I pay for this house, for your food, for your clothes, for everything. And you're complaining about your feelings?" Margaret felt her cheeks burning. "I'm not complaining. I just thought we could talk about—" "There's nothing to talk about," Robert interrupted, his voice getting louder. "I'm the head of this household. That's how God designed marriage. The husband leads, and the wife follows. If you have a problem with that, then you have a problem with God." Upstairs, they heard Sarah start crying. The raised voices had woken her up and scared her. Margaret started to get up to comfort their daughter, but Robert grabbed her wrist. "Sit down," he said quietly, but his grip was tight. "She needs to learn to stay in bed. If you run to her every time she cries, she'll never be independent." Margaret looked at Robert's hand on her wrist, then up at his face. For just a moment, she saw something that truly frightened her. His eyes were completely cold, like he was looking at a stranger instead of his wife. "Please let me go check on her," Margaret whispered. Robert stared at her for what felt like forever, then released her wrist. "Fine, but don't stay up there long. We're not finished talking." Margaret hurried upstairs to Sarah's room, her wrist throbbing where Robert had grabbed her. She found her daughter sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy, why was Daddy shouting?" Sarah asked, reaching her little arms out. Margaret picked up her daughter and held her tight, trying not to cry herself. "It's okay, baby. Everything's okay." But everything was not okay, and Margaret knew it as she rocked Sarah back to sleep. Margaret made a decision that she wouldn't act on for another 46 years. Someday, she promised herself, she would find the courage to leave. But first, she would have to survive decades more of a marriage that was slowly destroying her soul. Margaret didn't know it yet, but the worst was still to come. The controlling behavior, the emotional manipulation, the complete erosion of her sense of self. It would all get worse before it got better, much worse. And it would take her almost 50 years to finally find the strength to sign those divorce papers and choose peace over everything else. 20 years later, Margaret stood in her kitchen making Robert's breakfast, just like she did every single morning. But today was different. Today, she had a black eye that she was trying to hide with makeup, and her 23-year-old daughter Sarah was moving out of the house forever. "I can't watch this anymore, Mom," Sarah had whispered to her the night before, tears streaming down her face. "He's going to kill you someday, and I can't be here to see it happen." Margaret's hands shook as she flipped Robert's eggs. Sarah was wrong. Robert had never actually hit her. Well, except for last night. And that time 3 years ago. And maybe a few other times, but those didn't really count because Margaret had provoked him by talking back or not doing something the way he wanted. The physical violence was rare. It was the other stuff that happened every single day that was slowly killing her. "Margaret," Robert's voice boomed from the dining room. "Where's my coffee? How many times do I have to tell you? Breakfast is served at exactly 7 a.m. Margaret glanced at the clock. It was 7:02 a.m. She hurried to pour his coffee, her heart racing the way it always did when she knew she had messed up. Robert was sitting at the head of the table in his expensive suit, reading his newspaper. At 43, he was still handsome, still charming to everyone else, still the successful businessman that all their neighbors admired. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly, setting down his coffee cup. "Sarah needed help packing, and don't blame our daughter for your poor time management," Robert interrupted without looking up from his paper. "And speaking of Sarah, I've been thinking about her decision to move out. Margaret's stomach dropped. She knew that tone. I don't think it's a good idea for a young unmarried woman to live alone, Robert continued. It sends the wrong message. People will think we didn't raise her properly. She's 23, Robert, Margaret said carefully. She has a good job at the bank. She can afford her own apartment. Now Robert looked up from his newspaper, and Margaret immediately wished she had kept quiet. Are you disagreeing with me, Margaret? His voice was dangerously quiet. Margaret felt her throat close up with fear. After 20 years of marriage, she knew exactly what that tone meant. No, she said quickly. You just meant that you think you know better than I do about what's best for our family, Robert said, standing up slowly. Is that what you meant? Margaret took a step back, but Robert moved closer. He didn't touch her, but he stood so close that she could feel his breath on her face. I think you've forgotten who makes the decisions in this house, he said quietly. Maybe you need a reminder. That's when Sarah appeared in the doorway, carrying her last box of belongings. She took one look at the scene, her father towering over her cowering mother, and something in her face changed. Get away from her, Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. Robert turned to look at his daughter, genuinely surprised. Sarah had always been quiet around him, always tried to stay invisible. Excuse me, he said. I said get away from her, Sarah repeated, setting down her box and stepping between her parents. You don't get to intimidate her anymore. Not while I'm here. For a moment, the kitchen was completely silent. Margaret had never seen anyone stand up to Robert before. She didn't even know it was possible. Robert stared at his daughter for a long moment, then suddenly smiled. It was the charming smile that fooled everyone else, but Sarah wasn't fooled. Sarah, honey, you're misunderstanding the situation, he said in his smooth, reasonable voice. Your mother and I were just having a discussion about your living arrangements. I'm concerned about your safety, that's all. No, Sarah said firmly. You were intimidating, Mom, just like you always do. Just like you've done my entire life. Robert's mask slipped just for a second, and Margaret saw the real anger flash in his eyes. You're being dramatic, he said, his voice getting harder. And disrespectful. I don't know what kind of ideas these feminist friends of yours have put in your head, but nobody put ideas in my head, Dad, Sarah interrupted. I have eyes. I've watched you control and manipulate Mom for 23 years. I've watched you make her smaller and smaller until she's barely even a person anymore. Margaret gasped. She had tried so hard to hide the problems in her marriage from her daughter. She thought she had protected Sarah from the worst of it. Sarah, please, Margaret whispered. Don't make him angry. But Sarah turned to look at her mother, and Margaret saw something heartbreaking in her daughter's eyes, pity. Mom, do you hear yourself? Sarah said gently. You're begging me not to make him angry. That's not normal. That's not how marriage is supposed to work. Robert had heard enough. That's enough, he shouted, and both women flinched. Sarah, you will not disrespect me in my own house. And Margaret, you will not stand there and let her. Don't yell at her. Sarah shouted back, and Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. Nobody yelled at Robert. Nobody ever fought back. I'll yell at whoever I want. Robert roared. I am the man of this house. I work and pay for everything. You both live here because of me. And you never let us forget it. Sarah shot back. Mom can't buy groceries without asking your permission. She can't visit her own sister without you deciding if she's allowed to go. She can't even choose what to watch on TV without you having an opinion about it. Margaret felt like she was watching a car crash. Part of her was amazed at her daughter's courage, but mostly she was terrified of what Robert would do. You don't know what you're talking about, Robert said, but his voice was shaking with rage. Your mother is perfectly free to make her own choices. Sarah laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Really? Mom, when was the last time you made a decision without asking Dad's permission first? Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. She couldn't. Remember, when was the last time you bought something for yourself without feeling guilty about spending his money? Sarah continued. When was the last time you had an opinion that was different from his? Margaret felt tears starting to fall. Sarah was right about all of it. When was the last time you were happy, Mom? Sarah asked softly. The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. When was the last time she had been truly happy? When was the last time she had laughed without thinking about whether Robert would approve? When was the last time she had felt like herself instead of just Robert's wife? She couldn't remember that either. Robert must have seen the truth dawning on Margaret's face, because his expression became dangerous. "Get out," he said to Sarah, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm already leaving," Sarah replied, picking up her box. Again, "Get out now," Robert repeated. "And don't come back. If you want to disrespect your father, you can do it somewhere else." "Dad, Sarah started, but Robert cut her off. "You heard me. Leave. Now." Sarah looked at her mother with desperation. "Mom, come with me. Please. You don't have to live like this." Margaret felt her heart break. More than anything, she wanted to grab a bag and follow her daughter out the door. She wanted to run away from this house, from this life, from the person she had become, but she couldn't move. After 20 years of being told what to do, where to go, how to think, she had forgotten how to make big decisions for herself. "I can't," she whispered. "Yes, you can," Sarah said urgently. "Mom, you can. We'll figure it out together." "She can't because she knows where she belongs," Robert said coldly. "She knows that her place is here, taking care of her home and her husband. Don't you, Margaret?" Margaret looked at her husband, then at her daughter. Sarah represented freedom, possibility, a chance at a different life. But Robert represented 20 years of conditioning, of being told she was helpless, of believing she couldn't survive on her own. "I can't," she said again, and watched her daughter's heart break. "Okay," Sarah said quietly, tears falling down her face. "Okay, Mom. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be waiting." Sarah walked toward the door, then turned back one more time. "I love you, Mom," she said, "but I can't watch him destroy you anymore." And then she was gone. Margaret stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty doorway, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Robert put his hand on her shoulder, but instead of comfort, it felt like a chain. "See what happens when you don't back me up?" he said quietly. "Now our daughter hates us both." "She doesn't hate us," Margaret whispered. "She hates you," Robert corrected. "She thinks you're weak. She's ashamed of you." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Deep down, she was afraid Robert might be right. "But I still love you," Robert continued, his voice becoming gentle. "Even when you disappoint me, even when you don't support me the way a wife should, I still love you. I'm the only one who will ever love you just the way you are." Margaret closed her eyes and let the familiar manipulation wash over her. It was easier than fighting. It was easier than thinking. It was easier than admitting that her daughter was right about everything. Over the next few months, with Sarah gone, the house felt like a tomb. Margaret went through her daily routines like a robot. Wake up, make breakfast, clean house, make lunch, clean more, make dinner, go to bed. Every day was exactly the same. Robert seemed happier with Sarah gone. There was no one left to challenge him, no one to point out how wrong everything was. "It's nice to have peace in the house again," he would say. "Just the two of us, the way it should be." But it wasn't peace. It was the silence of defeat. Margaret tried to call Sarah several times, but her daughter's number was always busy or went straight to voicemail. After a few weeks, Margaret realized that Sarah was avoiding her calls. The rejection from her own daughter was almost more than Margaret could bear. Sarah was the one person who had ever stood up for her, and now she was gone too. Months turned into years. Margaret aged rapidly, as if the life was being drained out of her day by day. Her hair turned completely gray, lines appeared around her eyes, and she seemed to shrink in on herself. Robert, meanwhile, seemed to thrive. His business was doing well, he was respected in the community, and he had a wife who never questioned him or caused him any problems. When Margaret was 45, her mother died suddenly of a heart attack. At the funeral, Margaret saw relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. They all commented on how tired she looked, how quiet she had become. Margaret used to be so full of life, she heard her aunt whisper to someone. "I don't know what happened to her." Margaret wanted to scream, "Robert, happened to me." But instead, she just smiled politely and said nothing, the way she had learned to do about everything. After the funeral, Margaret's sister Linda pulled her aside. "Maggie, I'm worried about you," Linda said, using the childhood nickname no one had called her in decades. "You look, I don't know how to say this nicely, you look dead inside." Margaret felt tears starting. "I'm fine, Linda. Just tired from the funeral." "It's not just today," Linda said gently. "You've looked like this for years. Ever since you married Robert, actually." You used to be so vibrant, so full of dreams and plans. What happened to that girl? Margaret looked around to make sure Robert wasn't listening, then leaned closer to her sister. I don't know, she whispered, and realized it was true. She didn't know what had happened to the girl who used to want to travel the world and teach children and live a big, exciting life. That girl had disappeared so gradually that Margaret couldn't even remember when she had last seen her. It's not too late, you know, Linda said quietly. You're only 45. You could still have a whole other life if you wanted one. Margaret shook her head. I can't. I don't know how to live without him telling me what to do. The admission was humiliating, but true. Margaret had been controlled for so long that she genuinely didn't know how to make decisions for herself anymore. You could learn, Linda said. People do it all the time. They start over. But starting over seemed impossible. Margaret had no money of her own, no job skills, nowhere to go. Robert had made sure of that. I have to go, Margaret said, seeing Robert walking toward them with that fake smile he used in public. Think about what I said, Linda whispered urgently, but Margaret didn't think about it. She couldn't afford to think about it. Thinking about the life she could have led, the person she used to be, the woman she might have become, it hurt too much. Years continued to pass. Margaret's 50th birthday came and went without celebration. Her 55th, her 60th. Each year, she felt herself disappearing a little more. Sarah got married and had children, but she rarely visited. When she did come for holidays, the visits were short and tense. Margaret could see the pity in her daughter's eyes, and it was almost unbearable. Mom, you could still leave him, Sarah would say during their brief private moments. It's not too late. But it felt too late. Margaret was in her 60s now, with no money, no job experience, and no idea how to function in the world. Where would she go? How would she survive? This is my life, Margaret would tell Sarah. I made my choice a long time ago. You made your choice when you were 19. Sarah would argue. You're allowed to make a different choice now. But Margaret couldn't hear it anymore. The possibility of change felt as foreign as the possibility of flying to the moon. Then, just after Margaret turned 65, something happened that changed everything. Robert had a heart attack. It wasn't a massive one, and he recovered fully, but for 3 days in the hospital, Margaret got a taste of what life might be like without him. She made her own decisions about what to eat for breakfast. She watched the TV shows she wanted to watch. She went to bed when she was tired instead of when Robert decided it was bedtime. For 3 days, Margaret remembered what it felt like to be herself. When Robert came home from the hospital, he was more controlling than ever. The heart attack had scared him, and his fear made him want to hold on even tighter to everything he could control, especially Margaret. I need you to check on me every hour while I'm resting, he told her. I need you to prepare all my meals exactly according to the diet the doctor gave me. I need you to make sure I take my medications on time. Margaret did all of this willingly. She wanted Robert to recover. But she also couldn't stop thinking about those 3 days when she had been alone. Late at night, when Robert was sleeping, Margaret would lie awake and remember what it had felt like to choose her own breakfast. It was such a small thing, but it had felt like a miracle. That's when Margaret began to have a dangerous thought. What if Linda and Sarah were right? What if it really wasn't too late to have a different life? The thought terrified her, but once it entered her mind, she couldn't make it go away. At 67, Margaret did something she hadn't done in decades. She went to the library by herself and checked out a book about women who had started over late in life. She hid the book in her closet and read it in secret, a few pages at a time when Robert was at work or sleeping. The stories in the book amazed her. Women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s who had left bad marriages, started new careers, found love again, traveled the world, discovered talents they never knew they had. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be, one woman had written. I spent 40 years being who my husband wanted me to be. I decided to spend the rest of my life being who I wanted to be. Margaret read that sentence over and over again until she had it memorized. Who was she meant to be? She had forgotten so completely that she didn't even know where to start looking for the answer. But for the first time in decades, she wanted to find out. Margaret began making small changes, tiny rebellions that Robert didn't notice. She put sugar in her coffee even though Robert said it was unhealthy. She took longer routes to the grocery store so she could drive past the lake where she used to like to sit as a young woman. She bought herself a lipstick in a color Robert had once said was too bold for her. These were microscopic acts of independence. But to Margaret, they felt revolutionary. And on her 68th birthday, Sarah came to visit and brought her grandchildren. Two beautiful kids that Margaret barely knew because Robert had always made the visits so uncomfortable. "Grandma, why do you always look so sad?" Margaret's 8-year-old grandson asked during lunch. The question, coming from a child's honest mouth, hit Margaret like a lightning bolt. Why did she always look so sad? Because she was sad. She had been sad for so long that she had forgotten there was any other way to feel. That night, after Sarah and the kids had gone back to their hotel, Robert never let them stay in the house. Margaret looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. Gray-haired, hollow-eyed, defeated. She looked like someone who had given up on life years ago. "Who are you?" Margaret whispered to her reflection. She didn't know. But suddenly, desperately, she wanted to find out. The next morning, Margaret woke up before Robert and sat at the kitchen table drinking her coffee with sugar. She thought about her grandson's question, about the book hidden in her closet, about the woman she used to be. And for the first time in 50 years, Margaret began to imagine a different future. But imagining change and actually making change were two very different things. And Robert was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, one that would finally push Margaret past the point of no return. Margaret's hands were still shaking as she hung up the phone. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 weeks after her 69th birthday, and she had just received the most shocking news of her entire life. Robert was having an affair. Not just any affair. He was having an affair with Janet Morrison, their 45-year-old neighbor who had been Margaret's closest thing to a friend for the past 5 years. Janet, who came over for coffee every week. Janet, who had helped Margaret through her mother's death. Janet, who had listened to Margaret's quiet complaints about her marriage and offered sympathy. The phone call had come from Janet's own daughter, Lisa. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this," Lisa had said, her voice shaking with anger and embarrassment. "But I thought you should know. My mother and your husband, they've been seeing each other for over 2 years." Margaret had listened in stunned silence as Lisa explained how she had discovered the affair by accident when she used her mother's computer and found dozens of text messages between Janet and Robert. "He's been telling my mom that he's going to leave you," Lisa continued. "He says you're too old and boring for him now. He's been promising to divorce you and marry her." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat in her living room for hours, staring at nothing, trying to process what she had learned. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of giving up everything. Her dreams, her friends, her independence, her very sense of self, for a man who thought she was too old and boring. The betrayal was devastating, but what hurt even more was the realization that Robert had been planning to leave her anyway. All those years she had been afraid to leave him, worried about what would happen to her, and he had been making plans to abandon her. When Robert came home that evening, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her bathrobe, still trying to understand how her life had come to this moment. "You look terrible," Robert said by way of greeting. "Are you sick?" Margaret looked up at her husband, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. At 73, he was still an attractive man. His hair was silver now instead of dark, but he was in good shape, well-dressed, confident. He looked like a man who believed the world owed him whatever he wanted. "I got a phone call today," Margaret said quietly. "Oh, from who?" Robert was looking through the mail, not really paying attention to her. "From Lisa Morrison." Robert's hands stilled on the envelopes. "What did she want?" "She wanted to tell me about you and her mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert didn't deny it, didn't act surprised, didn't even look guilty. He just set down the mail and looked at Margaret with those cold eyes she had learned to fear so many years ago. "So you know," he said simply. Margaret had expected him to lie, to make excuses, to somehow turn this around and make it her fault the way he always did. His calm admission shocked her. "How long?" she asked. 2.5 years, Robert said, sitting down across from her at the table like they were discussing the weather. "What?" Robert shrugged. "Why do you think, Margaret? Janet makes me feel alive again. She's interested in the same things I am. She takes care of herself, keeps herself attractive. She makes me feel like a man. Each word was like a knife in Margaret's chest. And I don't. You. Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. Margaret, look at yourself. When was the last time you bought a new dress? When was the last time you did something interesting? When was the last time you had an opinion about anything that didn't come from me first? Margaret stared at him, feeling something building inside her chest that she hadn't felt in decades, rage. You made me this way, she said quietly. I made you. Robert's voice was mocking. I made you stop caring about how you look. I made you become boring. I made you turn into this sad, gray little mouse who shuffles around the house. Yes. The word came out louder than Margaret had intended. Yes, you did. You spent 50 years telling me I was stupid, that my opinions didn't matter, that I couldn't make decisions for myself. You cut me off from my friends. You made me quit my job. You controlled every dollar I spent, and every place I went, and every thought I had. Robert stared at her like she had grown a second head. Margaret realized it had been years since she had raised her voice to him. You made me small, Margaret continued, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. You made me afraid. You made me forget who I was before I met you. And now you're angry because I became exactly what you wanted me to become. What? I wanted. Robert stood up, his own anger rising. You think I wanted a wife who has no interests, no personality, no fire? You think that's what any man wants? Then why didn't you let me have those things? Margaret shot back, standing up too. Every time I tried to do something for myself, you shut it down. Every time I had an idea or an opinion, you told me I was wrong. You made me believe I was helpless. Asterisk. I tried to take care of you. Robert shouted. I worked every day to provide for you. I gave you a beautiful home, nice clothes, everything you needed. I needed to be a person. Margaret screamed, and the sound of her own voice at that volume shocked her. She couldn't remember the last time she had screamed. I needed to be myself. I needed to have friends and dreams and choices. I needed to matter. For a moment, they stared at each other across the kitchen table, both breathing hard. Margaret felt like she was seeing Robert clearly for the first time in decades, not as the powerful, controlling man she had feared, but as a selfish, weak person who had built his entire sense of worth on making another human being smaller. Well, now you know why I found someone else, Robert said finally, his voice cold again. Janet appreciates what I do for her. She doesn't scream at me or blame me for her own failures. Her own failures. Margaret felt the rage building again. What failures, Robert? What did I ever fail at except being exactly what you demanded? You failed at being a wife, Robert said cruelly. You failed at making me happy. You failed at being the kind of woman a man wants to come home to. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but something strange happened. Instead of crumbling the way she usually did when Robert attacked her, she felt herself getting stronger. Good, she said quietly. What? Good, Margaret repeated, louder this time. I'm glad I failed at being the kind of wife you wanted. Because the kind of wife you wanted was a slave. Robert's face turned red with anger. How dare you? How dare I what? Margaret interrupted, and she couldn't believe she was interrupting Robert. She had never interrupted him in 50 years of marriage. How dare I tell the truth? How dare I finally say what I should have said decades ago? You should be grateful, Robert shouted. Do you know how many women would kill to have what you have? A husband who provides for them, who takes care of everything, who never asks them to work or worry about money. A husband who has been cheating on them for years. Margaret asked. A husband who calls them boring and gray? A husband who is planning to leave them anyway. Robert's mouth snapped shut. He had forgotten that she knew about his plans to divorce her. Lisa told me everything, Margaret continued. She told me you've been promising to marry her mother. She told me you've been saying I'm too old and pathetic to be married to a man like you. Margaret, Robert started, but she wasn't finished. Do you know what the saddest part is? Margaret asked, tears starting to fall down her cheeks. The saddest part is that you're right. I am boring. I am gray. I am pathetic. But I wasn't always like this, Robert. I used to be vibrant and interesting and full of dreams. I used to have opinions and ideas and friends. I used to laugh and dance and think I could do anything. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked directly at her husband. You took all of that away from me, piece by piece, year by year, until there was nothing left but this scared, empty woman who asks permission to buy groceries. And now you want to throw me away because you don't like what you created. Robert was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, almost gentle. Margaret, you're being dramatic. We can work this out. Janet doesn't mean anything to me. She's just a distraction. We can go to counseling or take a vacation or… No, Margaret said firmly. No, no, we can't work this out. And no, I don't want to. Margaret felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For the first time in 50 years, I'm seeing this. Marriage clearly. And what I see is 50 years of emotional abuse. Abuse. Robert looked genuinely shocked. I never abused you. I never hit you except those few times when I what? Margaret asked quietly. When I deserved it. Robert had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's not what I meant. Those few times when I hit you were just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret continued. Every day, you told me I was stupid. Every day, you made me ask permission for things that adults shouldn't have to ask permission for. Every day, you reminded me that I was helpless without you. Every day, you made me smaller. She took a deep breath and said the words she had been afraid to say for 5 decades. That's not love, Robert. That's abuse. You're being ridiculous, Robert said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. I love you. I've always loved you. No, Margaret said sadly. You loved controlling me. You loved having someone who made you feel important and powerful. You loved having a wife who was too scared to question you or leave you or even think for herself. But you never loved me because you never let me be myself long enough to find out who I really was. Margaret walked to the counter and picked up the phone. What are you doing? Robert asked, and for the first time, he sounded worried. I'm calling a lawyer, Margaret said, dialing the number she had looked up earlier that day. Margaret, wait, Robert said, his voice taking on the smooth, persuasive tone he used when he wanted to manipulate her. You're upset. You're not thinking. Clearly. Why don't we sleep on this and talk about it tomorrow? I've been sleeping on this for 50 years, Margaret replied. I'm done sleeping. When the lawyer answered, Margaret took the biggest step of her life. Hello, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in decades. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I want to file for divorce. The next few months were the hardest and scariest of Margaret's entire life. Robert tried everything to change her. Mind, threats, promises, manipulation, even brief attempts at the charm he had used to win her when she was 19. But Margaret had finally seen through all of it, with the help of her lawyer, a kind woman named Patricia who specialized in helping older women leave abusive marriages. Margaret began the process of untangling 50 years of financial and emotional entanglement. It's never too late to start over, Patricia told her during one of their meetings. I've helped women in their 80s build new lives. You're still young enough to have 20 or 30 years of freedom ahead of you. Freedom. Margaret had almost forgotten what that word meant. Sarah was amazed when Margaret called to tell her about the divorce. Mom, I'm so proud of you, Sarah said, crying with joy over the phone. I knew you had it in you. I knew that strong woman I remembered from when I was little was still in there somewhere. I'm scared, Margaret admitted. I don't know how to live alone. I don't know how to pay bills or make decisions or even choose what to eat for breakfast. You'll learn, Sarah said confidently. And I'll help you. We all will. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. Robert fought it at first, trying to convince everyone, including Margaret herself, that she was having some kind of mental breakdown. But Margaret's resolve never wavered. On the day the divorce was final, Margaret sat in her lawyer's office, signing the papers that would end her marriage. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear this time, from excitement. How do you feel? Patricia asked as Margaret signed the last page. Margaret looked up, and for the first time in decades, she smiled a real smile. Free, she said. 2 weeks later, Margaret moved into a small apartment across town. It was tiny compared to the big house she had shared with Robert, but it was hers. Every decision, from the paint color on the walls to what TV shows to watch to what time to go to bed, was completely her own. The first few months of living alone were terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Margaret had to learn to do things she had never done before, manage her own bank account, fix things that broke, make social plans, even choose her own clothes without worrying about what Robert would think. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when the freedom felt overwhelming, when Margaret found herself paralyzed by having too many choices. There were nights when the loneliness felt crushing, when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But there were also magical moments that made everything worth it. The first time Margaret bought herself a bright red dress without asking anyone's permission. The first time she ate ice cream for dinner just because she wanted to. The first time she stayed up until 2 a.m. reading a book without anyone telling her to come to bed. The first time she made a friend. A woman named Dorothy from her apartment building who invited her to a book club. "I haven't read a book in years," Margaret confessed to Dorothy. "My husband thought reading was a waste of time." "Well, your ex-husband sounds like an idiot," Dorothy said cheerfully. "What kind of books did you used to like?" Margaret thought about it and realized she couldn't remember. She had stopped reading so long ago that she had forgotten what kinds of stories she enjoyed. "I guess I'll have to figure that out," she said. Slowly, Margaret began to rediscover herself. She learned that she loved mystery novels and romantic comedies. She discovered that she was good at crossword puzzles and terrible at cooking, but that she enjoyed trying new recipes anyway. She found out that she liked to wake up early and watch the sunrise from her small balcony. Most surprisingly, she learned that she was funny. Making Dorothy and the other women in the book club laugh felt like a superpower she had forgotten she possessed. That on Margaret's 70th birthday, Sarah threw her a party. It was small, just Sarah's family, Margaret's sister Linda, and a few of the new friends Margaret had made. But it was the first birthday party Margaret could remember enjoying in decades. "I have something to say," Margaret announced, standing up with her glass of wine. She had discovered that she actually liked wine, which Robert had never allowed her to drink. "Mom's making a speech," Sarah announced, grinning. "I just want to say thank you," Margaret began, looking around at the faces of people who loved her. "A year ago, I didn't think it was possible for someone my age to start over. I thought my life was over, that I had missed my chance at happiness." She paused, feeling emotional. Asterisk, "But I learned something important this year. It's never too late to save yourself. It's never too late to choose freedom over fear, peace over chaos, love over abuse. I may have wasted 50 years of my life, but I'm not wasting another day." Margaret raised her glass. "Here's to new beginnings, at any age." As everyone clinked glasses and cheered, Margaret felt a sense of joy she hadn't experienced since she was 19 years old. But this joy was different, deeper, stronger, earned through surviving decades of darkness. At T70, Margaret was finally becoming the woman she was always meant to be. 6 months later, something unexpected happened. Margaret met someone. His name was Frank. He was 72, and he was a widower who lived in her apartment building. They met in the laundry room when Margaret's washing machine broke down and Frank offered to help her fix it. "I used to be married to a man who never let me learn how to fix anything," Margaret told him as he worked on the machine. "He said women weren't good at mechanical things." Frank looked up at her with kind eyes. "Well, he was wrong. Would you like me to show you how this works?" Their first conversation lasted 3 hours. Their second lasted all night. Within a month, they were having coffee together every morning. Within 3 months, they were in love. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Margaret confessed to Frank one evening as they watched the sunset from her balcony. "What way?" he asked, taking her hand. "Happy," she said simply. "Just happy." Frank squeezed her hand. "You deserve to be happy, Margaret. You deserve to be cherished, not controlled." It was the first time in Margaret's life that a man had ever said she deserved anything. Frank was everything Robert had never been. He encouraged Margaret's independence, celebrated her opinions, supported her friendships, and treated her like an equal partner. When Margaret wanted to take a painting class, Frank drove her there and picked up supplies for her. When she decided to cut her gray hair short and dye it blonde, Frank told her she looked beautiful and took her out to dinner to celebrate. "I feel like I'm dating for the first time," Margaret told Sarah during one of their weekly phone calls. "I never really dated before I married your father. I went straight from my parents' house to being a wife. I never got to figure out what I wanted in a partner." "And what do you want?" Sarah asked. Margaret thought about it. "Kindness," she said. "Respect. Someone who sees me as a whole person, not just an accessory to their life. Someone who wants me to be happy, even if my happiness doesn't revolve around them." "Frank sounds perfect," Sarah said. "He's not perfect," Margaret laughed. "He leaves his socks on the floor, and he snores like a freight train. But he's perfect for me." Margaret was afraid to tell her children that she was thinking about moving. in with Frank. She worried they would think she was moving too fast or that it was inappropriate for someone her age to be in love. But when she finally worked up the courage to tell Sarah, her daughter's reaction surprised her. "Mom, I am so happy for you," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "You spent 50 years taking care of everyone else. You deserve to have someone who wants to take care of you." "I'm not moving in with him so he can take care of me," Margaret corrected gently. "I'm doing it because we take care of each other. There's a difference." And there was a difference. For the first time in her life, Margaret was in a relationship between equals. She and Frank made decisions together, supported each other's dreams, and respected each other's independence. When Margaret was 72, she did something she had dreamed about doing since she was a teenager. She took a college class. It was just a basic art history course at the community college, but to Margaret, it felt like climbing Mount Everest. "I'm probably too old for this," she told Frank nervously on the first day. "You're never too old to learn something new," Frank replied, kissing her forehead. "I'm proud of you for trying." Margaret loved the class. She loved learning about artists she had never heard of, loved writing papers, even though her writing was rusty, loved discussing ideas with people of all ages. Her professor was a woman in her 40s who treated Margaret's contributions with the same respect she showed the 20-year-old students. "Mrs. Thompson, your essay on Frida Kahlo was beautiful," the professor told her after class one day. "You have real insight into how art can be a form of healing." Margaret walked home that day feeling 10 feet tall. Someone had called her insightful. Someone had praised her mind, not just her ability to keep a clean house or make a good meal. That night, she called her grandson, Sarah's boy, who was now 16. "Grandma, you're taking college classes?" he asked, amazed. "That's so cool." "It is cool," Margaret agreed, laughing. "Who knew your old grandma could be cool?" "You're not old, Grandma," he said seriously. "You're just getting started." Margaret realized he was right. At 72, she wasn't ending her story. She was finally beginning at point 3 years later. Margaret was sitting in a coffee shop with Dorothy, discussing the book club's latest selection, when a young woman approached their table. "Excuse me," the woman said nervously. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. You mentioned that you got divorced in your late 60s. "I did," Margaret said kindly. "Why do you ask?" The woman sat down uninvited, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm 45, and I've been married for 20 years to a man who sounds a lot like your ex-husband. Everyone tells me I'm crazy to even think about leaving at my age. They say I'm too old to start over, that no one will want me, that I should just be grateful for what I have." Margaret reached across the table and took the woman's hand. "Honey," she said gently, "I'm 75 years old, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that it is never too late to save yourself. Never too late to choose happiness. Never too late to become who you were meant to be." The woman started crying harder. "But I'm scared. I don't know how to live alone. I don't know how to make decisions for myself." "I know," Margaret said. "I was terrified too. But you know what I discovered? Being scared of freedom is still better than the certainty of misery. And once you take that first step, you find out you're stronger than you ever imagined." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a business card for Patricia, her divorce lawyer. "Call her," Margaret said. "Tell her Margaret Thompson sent you. She'll help you figure out your options." The woman clutched the card like a lifeline. "Do you really think I can do this? Do you really think it's not too late for me?" Margaret smiled, thinking about all the adventures she'd had in the past 6 years, the college classes, the art she'd learned to paint, the friends she'd made, the love she'd found with Frank, the relationship she'd rebuilt with her children, the confidence she'd discovered, the woman she'd finally become. "Honey," Margaret said, "your life doesn't end at 45 or 65 or 75 or any age. Your life begins the moment you decide to start living it for yourself." As Margaret watched the young woman walk away with new hope in her eyes, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her story had become more than just her own survival. It had become proof that it's never too late to choose love over fear, peace over chaos, freedom over captivity. Margaret had married for love at 19, but she had divorced for peace at 69. And at 75, she had finally learned the most important lesson of all. The best time to start living your authentic life is right now. No matter how old you are, no matter how scared you feel, no matter what anyone else says that it's never, ever too late to save yourself. And sometimes, saving yourself is the most loving thing you can do, not just for you, but for everyone who needs to see that escape is possible, that healing is real, and that happiness is always an option, even when it seems impossible. Margaret's story wasn't a tragedy about a woman who wasted 50 years of her life. It was a triumph about a woman who found the courage to save the rest of it.